Uh, Good afternoon, Masa al Khair. Good morning, Sabah al Khair to those joining us from North America. My name is Yoram Meital, and I'm delighted to serve as moderator of this session. The idea to convey a conference on Maimonides began 4 years ago. We envisioned a conference in Cairo where Moshe or Musa ben Maimun lived most of his life and developed his biblical, philosophical, and medical writings, making him a one-of-a-kind intellectual historical figure. The outbreak of the corona pandemic changed the plan for the invited scholars to meet in Cairo. Therefore, we do not meet at Maimonides Synagogue in the Jewish neighborhood, Harat el-Yahud of Cairo today as planned, but in the virtual space of the Zoom. The conference steering committee is delighted with the excellent response from leading experts from various universities worldwide. Anyone who has seen the conference's program praised it. This is the place to warmly thank the partners who work behind the scene, the members of the conference steering committee, Magda Harun, the president of the Jewish community in Cairo, Sami Ibrahim, who heads the Drop of Milk Association, and Marwa Suleiman, who runs the Earth Center. I was delighted to join hands with them and to work in such a good spirit of friendship on organizing this conference, very much as we did in previous projects over the years. Our profound thanks and gratitude go to the devoted and engaged members of the Drop of Milk Association, Femuni Okasha, Suraya Bahagat, and Heba Shauki, who worked tirelessly to organize the conference. The steering committee and guest speakers owe a deep appreciation to Nisrin Khalid, who skillfully accompanied the work on the conference program and kept in constant contact with all of us. Thank you so much, Nisrin. The conference, Maimonides from Córdoba to Cairo, a journey through time and knowledge, was opened yesterday with opening remarks by Magda Harun, Audrey Azoulay, Director General of UNESCO, and Jonathan Cohen, US Ambassador to Egypt. They highlighted the relevance of Maimonides' views as a model of religious tolerance in Egypt and elsewhere, in his lifetime and other eras, including our time. Today, the conference moves on to 14 lectures by scholars from different disciplines, presenting lectures on a broad spectrum of topics that might shed light on Maimonides' life, philosophy, and writings in various fields of knowledge. This conference aims to examine various aspects of Maimonides' teachings and legacy in the geographical and epistemological space in which he operated. In this ambience, we wish to discuss a series of questions on the networks of knowledge and values related to his work. How Maimonides' philosophy and its interpretations are bound with the relations between Jews and Muslims living in the same geographical, cultural, and social space. What part did the Cairo Geniza play in preserving Maimonides' thoughts? Which values can be derived from Maimonides' view and insights today, despite the differences in circumstances of our time? How do the places where Maimonides lived and operated serve as memorial sites that attract diverse groups, both local and foreigner. What is the Maimonides' place in introducing cultural knowledge, religious philosophy, and practices in popular and scholarly circles? Maimonides' philosophical and cultural heritage is shared by many, regardless of religious or national origin. How can its preservation be promoted? I am delighted to serve as a moderator of this session, which includes three leading scholars whose writings are familiar to many of us. Each speaker has 15 minutes, or maybe 16 or 17, and I will present them in the order they appear in the program. Questions for speakers can be conveyed via chat. The first speaker is Marina Rusto, a professor of Jewish civilization in the Near East at Princeton University. She is a 2015 MacArthur Fellow. As a social historian, she studies Judeo-Arabic documents found in the Cairo Geniza and Arabic papyri. Most of her studies centered on Egypt and Syria from the 10th century to the 15th. From her many publications, I would like to mention two books from which I have learned a lot: Heresy and the Politics of Community, the Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, published in 2014, and The Lost Archive, Traces of a Caliphate in a Cairo Synagogue, published just 1 year ago. In addition, Professor Rosto is a dear friend of the community, and we are delighted to have you with us this afternoon or morning in your home place. The title of her lecture today is Maimonides, Life in Medieval Fustat, Cairo. Marina, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yoram, for your very kind introduction. Dear friends, dear colleagues, Masa al-Khair, Sabah al-Khair. I'm really happy to see all of you, and I hope you're doing well despite all the various circumstances. You can see my slide full screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. And does the slide advance?
Yeah.
You see a different slide now? Okay, perfect. That's great. So I'm really happy to see all of you, and I hope you're doing well. I have many times over the last year and a half wished I were in Cairo, not medieval Cairo, which is where I live in my mind always, but modern Cairo, and now is one of those times. The research that I'm going to share with you today is the story, a story of discovery, specifically my discovery, that Jews in the Middle Ages were even more cosmopolitan than I realized, despite a long time studying Geniza documents. My map of the Jewish world in the 12th and 13th centuries had always looked something like this. And what I learned is that it's actually much bigger and goes much further east. So I'm going to be talking about global trade just before and after Maimonides' lifetime, the same global trade that helped subsidize his long years of writing the Guide of the Perplexed, both via his brother David's participation in the Indian Ocean trade and also via his direct investment in the Ibn al-Amshati business partnership. But I'm not going to begin in India. I'm going to begin in medieval China. The Princeton University Art Museum owns a Chinese porcelain vase, apparently from the Liao dynasty, identified as such because it resembles other vases that have been found near Beijing and in the Liaoning province in northern China. It was discovered in sherds and it was pieced together once it reached Princeton in 1966 through the courtesy of the Department of Antiquities of the United Arab Republic, which some of you may remember. The vase is, for its near complete survival, very important and remarkable. It also appears to be rare in that it was found among dozens of less refined glazed earthenware, and stoneware fragments. But one way in which it's not rare is where it was found. And you can probably figure out where it was found just by looking at what it was found with. This porcelain vase was not excavated in China. It was excavated in Misr al-Qadima, henceforth Fustat, the medieval residential urban core of the city, eventually known as Cairo. There is a long history of excavations at Fustat over the course of the 20th century. Between 1912 and 1924, Ali Bahgat, curator and then director of the Museum of Arab Art, now the Museum of Islamic Art, here proudly displaying his Ottoman Turkish roots, directed an excavation that was in part meant to wrangle the Sabah diggers of the west bank of the Nile who were already excavating at the site of Fustat and disturbing its contents. So that was up until 1924. Between 1964 and 1980, the American Research Center in Cairo sponsored a dig under the auspices of George T. Scanlon, here looking uncharacteristically awestruck. Here is a more characteristic view of him in the field. There were later excavations by Japanese missions from Waseda University in collaboration with the Idemitsu Museum, and then by a French mission, and there were some in between Bahgat and Scanlon as well. Because the site had been used for a quarry for building materials and a mine for sabach, fertilizer, not all of the objects can be well contextualized. For many, there's simply no stratigraphy, so we can't tell exactly when they came from or what kind of context. But there is more than enough context for these objects from other sources, a point that I'll return to in a bit. These objects, including the Chinese celadon vase, are from George Scanlon's excavations, and they represent but a tiny proportion of the finds from Scanlon's dig. These are all just the ones at the Princeton University Art Museum. In rough chronological order of acquisition, there are at least 6 museums worldwide that own material from Scanlon's excavations. The Islamic Museum in Cairo, of course, the Princeton University Art Museum, the Corning Museum of Glass in New York State, the Akron Art Museum in Ohio, the University of Chicago Oriental Institute, which just discovered much of its Scanlon material a few years ago in conjunction with an exhibition, a wonderful exhibition that they did on Fustat, and the University of Oxford Ashmolean Museum. And there are also rumors of other stashes of Scanlon materials in Toronto and possibly elsewhere, but establishing their whereabouts will require archival research that has yet to be done. And that's always the case with these scattered collections, the Geniza included. You have to really do the research before you understand what is where and why. But I've come to realize that the Chinese finds were perhaps even more significant than Scanlon realized. Scanlon himself was obviously aware that the Chinese fragments were important, but he didn't take a couple of final steps in his argument, and I want to try and take those for him. Scanlon established, on the one hand, that this vase is of a type of porcelain celadon that was widely imitated in Egypt, although it could never be reproduced precisely in Egypt because Egypt lacked the kaolin-rich clay that enabled Chinese porcelain to be fired at very high temperatures without liquefying. An analysis by a Swedish porcelain expert, Bo Gillensvärd, of 4,000 of Scanlon's Chinese sherds established that 75% were actually from celadon Song era pieces. So this means that Chinese wares were not exceptional at Fustat. They were actually quite abundant. But Scanlon couldn't explain how on earth these Chinese vases had ended up in Fustat, and the explanations that he proposed were partial and somewhat arbitrary. How these early types of Chinese ware got to Egypt, he wrote, is problematical and will remain so until some earnest archaeological research is undertaken in the port cities of the Red Sea, particularly Aideb. So it was as though Scanlon didn't actually believe the evidence that he was holding in his very hands. There are 3 perplexing things about this sentence. First, how Chinese wares got to Egypt is not a mystery, and the mystery is immediately solved when you look at Geniza fragments, and I'll come back to that in a second. Second, Aideb actually had been excavated by the British in the 1920s, and Scanlon, of course, knew this, and knew that it had yielded dozens of Chinese celadon wares of the 11th through 13th centuries that are now at the British Museum, although they're not on display, and I couldn't find any images of them online. But the British excavation had not actually succeeded in locating the port of Aydab. That's something that people are actually writing about now. They're wondering if maybe the port that was used for Aydab was 20 kilometers away in a different site. So that brings us to the third problem, which is that there were many other medieval Red Sea ports. So many that it isn't at all clear why Scanlon should have focused on Aydab in particular. So this is a kind of general state of confusion about Egypt's medieval trade with China. And it's actually persisted in the Princeton Art Museum's description of the vase, which I should probably talk to them about. They say, sorry, I just skipped a slide. They say it is possible that this bottle traversed overland to Egypt along the Liao-dominated Silk Route. So they're speculating a land route. It may also have traveled via illicit Liao-Song trade to finally reach Egypt along established Song Dynasty maritime trade routes. So they admit the possibility of a maritime trade route, but they're also saying that the Indian Ocean routes were a mercantile realm developed by the Song Dynasty, when in fact it was also an Abbasid and a Fatimid realm just as much. So this is basically, I mean, this is based on kind of, historical mythology about the Silk Road rather than actual evidence. But one person who knew perfectly well that there was a burgeoning Indian Ocean trade was S.D. Goitein. But oddly, he didn't draw the necessary conclusions either. Goitein began discovering and publishing evidence of the trade between Egypt and China as early as 1950. Among the documents that he identified and classified into the 7 subcorpora that comprise his India book, there was a wonderful letter complaining about the annoyances of travel. And I have to say, every time I read this letter, I think of you, Sammy, so this is for you. This is a trader who had a house in Alexandria, but was apparently originally from Libya and was writing to his brother back in Tripoli. The year is 1103. And he's complaining about the sea route from Fustat to India. So the sea route looked a little bit like this. You went up the Nile to Qus, and then you crossed over to Qusair. You hit a bunch of ports on the Red Sea, Aydab, Sawakin, Badia, Dahlak, and then finally you got to Aden, at which point you would sail with the monsoon winds through open water across the Indian Ocean to the Malabar coast. So the way he renders this journey is a little bit different. He says, I left Fustat after Iyar of the year 4863, so that's 1103, and we reached Qus after 2 months, which is a very long time. I'm not quite sure what was going on there. Then I arrived in Aydab, which is truly a city of tribulations. Innahu balad al-adab. Okay, he's going to do this whole thing in rhyme. Then we left al-Maqla'in and set sail in a ship that had in it not a single nail of iron, ma fiha masmar hadid, but rather was tied together with ropes. Wallah yastur bi sitrihi, may God protect us with his shield. So this is a Mediterranean man who has never sailed in a boat that lacks nails. But in this case, he had to, because Indian Ocean craft were tied together with coconut wire ropes, which is perfectly sturdy, but he didn't know that because he wasn't used to it. We arrived in a city called Sawakin, which is truly the most frightening of places, Ahad Mawakin. I mean, he's funny, right? Then we arrived at a city called Badia, which means the one that cuts, for it is just as the name says, here he says in Hebrew, ki kishma kenhi, the most bitter, frightening, and miserable of places, amar achad ashar mawadiyah. Then we arrived at a city called Dahlak. The following adage is said about it, but you surpass them all, that's the biblical quotation. It is a ruinous land, wahiya balad muhlik. Okay, so first of all, here we have some very good Geniza puns and some very nice letter writing. When was the last time you wrote an email like this? And did people actually laugh? I laugh every time I read this letter. But enjoyment aside, the letter is evidence that Aydab was merely a link in a longer chain of seaports on the Red Sea coast, despite Scanlon's hope of pinning his entire explanation for Chinese porcelain on Aydab. There might equally well have been Chinese porcelain at Qusair, Dahlak, or Aden. For Chinese porcelain at Aden, we have confirmation from a Geniza letter that was recently discussed in an excellent article by Elizabeth Lambourne and Phil Lieberman, from whom you'll hear in a bit. A Jewish ship owner in Aden named Madmun ibn Yefet explains to a long-distance trader in Fustat that he's enclosed with his letter a Chinese textile and 6 tumblers of transparent Chinese porcelain. And he asks him to distribute these as gifts to his family and officers of the Jewish community in Fustat. But Madmun ben Yafet then has doubts about the propriety of the gift because porcelain status in Jewish law is unclear. It raises the following question: does a ceramic vessel that looks and behaves like glass contract ritual impurity like a porous ceramic vessel, or since it's non-porous like glass, is it also impervious to ritual impurity? Lamborn and Lieberman deftly zero in on the problem as one of confounding categories. I'm just going to skip the text in the interest of time. And they summarize it as follows: although various types of Chinese ceramic had been entering the Middle East since the first half of the 9th century, which I also have corroborated through my research, sometimes in huge quantities, this particular ceramic fabric presented Jewish scholars and householders at the port of Aden with a perplexing problem, since its properties confounded their expectations of how a ceramic fabric should look, feel, and behave. And thus they wrote to Fustat for advice. Lamborn and Lieberman argued that the emphasis in this legal query on the translucency of the vessels suggests that what Madmun has sent from Aden isn't just any Chinese ware or Chinese celadon ware, such as the one that I showed you, but more specifically, something called pingbai, literally blue-white, a type of porcelain that could be made so thin that light passed through it. And that's important because it could be evidence that pingbai reached Egypt considerably earlier than we thought. Lamborn and Lieberman spend more time discussing when pingbai arrived in Fustat than discussing how. And to them, I mean, that's, it's clear how. The 10th century geographer Al-Maqdisi, they remind us, had already described Aden as the Dihliz Sin, the vestibule of China. The Geniza letter at the center of their article demonstrates that India traders brought or sent Chinese wares back to Egypt with some regularity. So the answer to Scanlon's mystery, then, is that these masses and masses of Chinese wares got to Fustat the same way everything else got to Fustat. They were carried there by adventurous people looking to consolidate their social ties and make some money while doing so along the most traveled trade routes of their era. Okay, so there was at least one Jew sending Chinese wares from Aden to Egypt, and I doubt he was the only one. It's perplexing then that Goitein made a point of noting that Jewish traders in the Indian Ocean had no direct contacts with China. Goitein says here in his book on the India trade, not a single Geniza letter referring to direct contacts with China has been discovered thus far. So oddly, his vision of the India trade of the Geniza stopped just west of the Java Sea. This is interesting because there's contrary information implicit in a document that Goitein himself had published in 1973 in Letters of Medieval Jewish Traders. This is the last document I'll present, which will also bring us finally to Maimonides, or at least to his descendants. This is a court record in the hand of Maimonides' son, Avraham Maimoni, written in 1226 to establish the legal fact that a Jewish trader, Abul Fadl ibn Mukhtar al-Iskandari, had died while abroad. The witness who testifies before Maimoni had been in the Malabar in India and checked the information there and then returned to Fustat and testified about it before Avraham Maimoni and a witness. So testimonies about, this is like, it's kind of a normal document in the sense that testimonies about the far off death of traders happened frequently because families needed information, wives needed to remarry, the Jewish community and or the Fatimid and Ayyubid bureaucracies needed a certificate of death, they needed tax payments. None of that would have been unusual. Such legal questions kept long distance merchants connected to Egypt, just as a century earlier, the problem of Chinese porcelain had connected the ship owner in Yemen to the Jewish community in Fustat. So the fact that a far-off trader's death is registered in Fustat isn't strange. What's interesting here, rather, is where this trader is said to have died, but we're going to have to do a little bit of paleography to get there. So Goitein's translation of this document from 1973 says the lines in question, Abul Fadl ibn Mukhtar al-Iskandari, known as Ibn something, it's hard to read the manuscript there, died in Kala, which is in the country of, and then again, something that Goitein could not read in the manuscript. Well, it turns out that we actually know where Kala is, sort of. It's on the Malay Peninsula. And while there's a ridiculous amount of scholarly argumentation about precisely where on the Malay Peninsula, that doesn't matter for us. But there are strong arguments for it being in the lowlands toward the north of this circle. And that would actually be interesting because the lowlands, the Isthmus of Kra, now in Thailand, served at a certain point as a thoroughfare for merchants crossing from the Eastern Indian Ocean to China due to the famously difficult and deadly waters of the South China Sea, which sailors still avoid at all costs. Now, I see ellipses, I see these dots, and I get very excited, like a shark smelling blood. I think maybe there's something there. Maybe the digital images can help us to see more than Goitein could see in person at Cambridge. So I looked at the manuscript for a long time, called in reinforcements from my colleague, Michael Laffin, who specializes in pre-modern Southeast Asia, and we came up with a solution. So the text isn't easy to read. Maimonides' hands is both characteristically Sephardi and also just peculiar, like it's really his own strange handwriting. So you kind of have to get used to it. But the crucial lines here say that Abu al-Fadl ibn Mukhtar al-Iskandari al-Ma'ruf bi ibn Arashie توفي في كلا من بلاد, and then this is like the word in question that's extremely hard to make out, but we looked at it for a long time and figured out that what it says is El Jawa, so in the lands of Java. Now, as I just showed you, Kala is not, in fact, in the lands of Java. Kala is this, Java is this island over here, whereas Kala is the first circle that I just showed you. In fact, in Arabic usage of the Middle Ages, Java wasn't just this island, it was actually the entire region of Southeast Asia. Moreover, it was considered the gate. Yeah.
I would appreciate if you could go to the conclusion. Time is running.
Absolutely. I'm almost at the conclusion. Thank you, Yoram. So basically, when Goitein says there's no direct contact with China in the Geniza, it's misleading. There's actually no direct route anywhere in this period. Trade was segmented because travel was slow, people stopped in ports, and to focus on the direct route to China is a bit of a misleading direction of analysis. The point that I want to make here is that even a segmented trade system is nonetheless a coherent trade system. If Abraham Maimoni accepted, even within the stringent standards of Jewish law, that he could hear testimony from an India trader in Fustat about the death in Al-Jawa of a trader who bears the Egyptian Nisba al-Iskandari, then clearly the Jewish world and even the rabbinic world of the Middle Ages went well beyond my initial map. So we should not take Goitein's word for it. Looking for direct contacts with China misses the more interesting story of the abundant smaller links artisanally forged in the social chain that stretched from Sfarad to Sumatra and quite possibly from Córdoba to Kaifeng. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. And we move on fast to our next speaker, is Sarah Strumza, the Alice and Jack Ormuth Professor Emerita of Arabic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the European Academy of Sciences and Arts, and the American Philosophical Society. Her studies focus on intellectual history and encounters, especially the history of philosophical and theological thought in Arabic during the early Islamic Middle Ages, medieval Judeo-Arabic literature, and the intellectual history of Muslims and Jews in Islamic Spain. Among her many published studies, Maimonides, in his Word, Portrait of a Mediterranean Thinker, was published in 2010. Free Thinkers of Medieval Islam, Ibn al-Rawadi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, and their impact on Islamic thought, published in 1999. The title of Professor Strumza's lecture today is Maimonides' Mediterranean Path. Sarah, floor is yours.
Thank you, Yoram. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, and I thank the conveners of this conference for inviting me and for the opportunity to be in Cairo, even if just virtually. As I listened to Marina's fascinating lecture and looked at the trade routes, it reminded me that we actually used to travel from one place to another, even if not in boats tied by ropes, but we used to fly, and normally we all would be together sitting in Cairo. So inshallah, one day we will do that soon. But for the time being, I'm just thankful for the opportunity to see you all in little boxes on my screen. Marina mentioned the Geniza, and I think, although I don't show documents, I think we'll go back in this conference often to the Geniza. Among the hundreds of thousands of fragments found in the Cairo Geniza, it happens that one begins to recognize a familiar handwriting. Maimonides is a prime example of such an immediately recognizable handwriting, as unique as fingerprints. Quite often, the sample of his handwriting consists of a single line at the bottom of a question addressed to him, where he curtly adds his verdict, permitted or forbidden, and signs his first name, written by Moshe, the Chatav Moshe. At other times, he took the trouble to sign with his full name, I, Moshe, the son of Maimon the Sephardi. Ani Moshe ben Maimon HaSfaradi. The identification as a Sephardi, an Andalusian or a Spaniard, was not a temporary feature of his name, used by a new immigrant to introduce himself, and it meant more than the mere biographical fact of being a native of the Iberian Peninsula. Being a Sephardi was an enduring and important part of Maimonides' self-image as a legal authority as well as a philosopher, which he maintained and cultivated throughout his life. It conjured up the pride of Andalusian Jews in their ancestry, which they believed to go back to the elite of the Jerusalemites exiled after the destruction of the First Temple. It also reflected Maimonides' conscious identification with a distinctive Andalusian culture, as well as with the traits that distinguish the Jewish Andalusian culture from that of other Jewish communities. Thus, in his Guide of the Perplexed, written in 1198, we see him interrupting the course of the discussion in chapter 171 in order to point out the way that the philosophical leanings of Andalusian Jews differ from these of their brethren in the Islamic East. According to him, all Jews in the East, both Rabbanites and Karaites, blindly followed in the footsteps of the Muslim theological school of the Mu'tazila, whereas, I quote, all the Andalusians of our own religious community cling to the views of the philosophers. A difference that Maimonides clearly sees as a mark of the Andalusian intellectual superiority. Maimonides' lifelong insistence on his Andalusian identity is all the more remarkable in view of the fact that he left Al-Andalus as a young adolescent and spent most of his adult life in Egypt. Behind the local patriotic tag of Sephardi, however, Maimonides constructed a different intellectual profile, that of an international scholar, reflecting his many excursions in person as well as in reading. Maimonides' intellectual profile reflects a world that revolved around the Mediterranean basin. It was fed by successive civilizations that flourished on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, and it encompassed distant cultures interconnected through crisscrossing trade routes by land and sea. And we have seen a wonderful example of it just now. It is in this sense that Shlomo Dov Goitein could name his magnum opus on the Cairo Geniza a Mediterranean society, and could view people like Maimonides as Mediterranean people. None of these people identified themselves as a Mediterranean. They were a Muslim, a Jew, or a Christian, but the Mediterranean civilizations gave the frame of reference to their distinct identities. All aspects of Maimonides' work, be it legal, philosophical, or scientific, are dictated by his Mediterranean background. Maimonides' life circulated the shores of the Mediterranean, and the determining points of his biography are associated with locations ranging between the Iberian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent. He was born in 1136 or 38 to a respected and learned Jewish family in the city of Córdoba. It is there that he completed a thorough Jewish education, and it is also in Córdoba that he received his basic philosophic and scientific education, which included at the very least logic and the theoretical rudiments of medicine. Córdoba was then ruled by the Almoravids, a Sunni Berber dynasty which adhered to the Maliki Madhab, the Muslim legal school then dominant in the Iberian Peninsula. According to Muslim law, the Jewish and Christian communities were allowed a certain degree of protected religious autonomy, the Zimma, provided they adhered to the rules that regulated their status as subordinate religious minorities. Some cracks in the Zimma system began to show already under the Almoravids, but the Jewish community of Córdoba remained relatively stable. In 1148, however, Córdoba was overtaken by another Berber dynasty, the Almohads, the Muwahhidun, who were formerly Sunnis, but had a rather idiosyncratic interpretation of the law. Almohad law deprived the religious minorities of their protected status, obliging them to choose between converting to Islam or going into exile. This Almohad persecution forced Maimonides' family out of Córdoba, and there is no record of their first years of wandering. It is possible that, like other refugees of Almohad persecutions, they went north to take refuge in Christian Spain. Another possibility is that, like most of the Jewish community, they simulated conversion already then and remained in Almohad territory, perhaps spending some time in Sevilla. In 1160, when Maimonides was in his early 20s, the family moved to Fez, close to the North African capital of the Almohads, where it remained for about 5 years, living like the rest of the Jewish community as crypto-Jews. As a young adult, Maimonides thus lived in the Maghreb, and it is there that he was trained as a physician. Around 1165, he left Fez to Palestine, which was then controlled by the Crusaders, but did not stay there. And after a few months, the family finally settled down in Fatimid Egypt, where Maimonides died in 1204. Maimonides' brother, as we heard, David, was involved in the India trade, and it was his drowning in the Indian Ocean that forced Maimonides to seek work as the court physician in Fustat. Still wider than the parameters of Maimonides' biography are the geographical parameters outlined by his literary profile. The center of his intellectual endeavor was undoubtedly the Jewish world, and his primary identity as a Jewish intellectual meant that he mastered Jewish religious and legal literature in Hebrew as well as in Aramaic, and in Judeo-Arabic. The Hebrew Bible, as well as the Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds, the various Midrashim, and the Gaonic literature. As such, the Fertile Crescent, the Levant, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as Iraq and the Syrian Jazeera, and Persia, Iran, were an integral part of his world. Furthermore, his correspondence demonstrates his interactions with Jewish societies that stretched across the cultural Mediterranean world from what was called then Provence, Catalonia and southern France, to Baghdad and as far south as the Yemen. By comparison, the Jewish communities that lived outside this southern-leaning Mediterranean, in Ashkenaz, are hardly present in his world, and scholars have already noted the striking absence of a person like Rashi from his writings. Maimonides' cultural Mediterranean encompassed the legacy of other religious communities. This is reflected in his references to his contemporaries, and still more so in his references to past thinkers. Greek philosophical tradition, as interpreted and elaborated by philosophers from the Islamic East and from Al-Andalus, formed the cornerstone of his philosophical world. Maimonides is commonly categorized as a philosophe, that is to say, an Aristotelian philosopher. The Arabic Aristotelian tradition, however, blended Platonic political philosophy and Plotinian metaphysics together with the logic and physics of Aristotle. This blend reflects the metamorphosis of the school tradition as it traveled through the efforts of Zoroastrian, Christian, and Muslim translators from Athens to Alexandria, Nisibis, Jundishapur, and Baghdad, and was translated from Greek to Syriac, Middle Persian, and Arabic. Sciences, astronomy, and medicine and mathematics were part and parcel of the philosopher's education, and in Maimonides' references to the sciences, we find the same multi-layered legacy also revealed in his philosophy. Maimonides' intellectual world incorporated other philosophical traditions, which, although rejected by Maimonides, undoubtedly had a profound influence on his thought. He boasts of his vast readings, including the study of the so-called Sabian literature, which he believed consisted of Arabic translations of genuine ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts. The richness and diversity that we can discover in examining the philosophical tradition that Maimonides inherited from his predecessors is further confirmed and further enriched when we examine the profile of his contemporaneous culture and the way he was influenced by the intellectual and religious traditions he encountered, including those that he criticized. As mentioned above, it seems probable that under the Almohads, Maimonides' family had to simulate conversion to Islam, a traumatic experience to which Maimonides himself alludes. According to Muslim sources, it is thus that Maimonides came to read the Quran and to study Muslim law, fiqh. In Maimonides' theological and legal writings, we can thus find some innovative ideas which may well reflect the innovations of the Almohad revolution. When Maimonides arrived in Egypt, it was still ruled by the Fatimids, who, like other Ismaili Shiites, adopted Neoplatonic philosophy as part of their religious doctrine. The Ismaili predilection for the occult sciences received from Maimonides the same harsh remarks that Sabian science did. He also squarely rejected their allegorical hermeneutics. Nevertheless, the Ismaili brand of Neoplatonism seems to have left its mark on his own philosophy, either directly or through the works of Jewish Neoplatonists. Maimonides' Neoplatonism reflects also, in a roundabout way, also the impact of Sufism, but it remained to Maimonides' descendants to cultivate and develop the Jewish Sufi trend and to establish a pietistic mystical school in Egypt. In 1171, Egypt was conquered by the Ayyubids, Sunni Muslims who had adopted strict Ash'ari theology. Maimonides was closely familiar with the intricacies of Islamic theology or Kalam, and is known to have participated in theological discussions with Muslims, although he had little respect for the Kalam, both in its earlier Mu'tazilite form and in its contemporary dominant Ash'arite version. During Maimonides' lifetime, the Jewish community underwent several significant changes. 12th century Baghdad was no longer the center of hegemony for Jewish communities, and with Maimonides' stature, Egypt overshadowed Baghdad. But although Maimonides contributed significantly to the development of the Cairene Jewish center, the balance of forces was tipping more and more towards Europe, Provence, northern France, and Ashkenaz. The shift in Maimonides' linguistic preferences from Judeo-Arabic to Hebrew reflected his awareness of these developments. It testifies to his ability to realize the significance of the shift of balance from the Judeo-Arabic Mediterranean to a Hebrew-speaking Jewish world that includes Christian Europe, and to adjust to it. This quick panorama of Maimonides' activity, the personal and scholarly paths he walked across a wide geographical and historical landscape, gives a taste of his broad intellectual spectrum. Maimonides, the philosopher, the erudite, the man of law, the leader of the community. His own towering personality was, no doubt, the leading force behind his astounding versatility. At the same time, we must not forget that the historical context has its share in shaping a person. The fact that the context for Maimonides was so diverse must be fully appreciated. For example, had the indigenous culture of Spain remained isolated, it would probably not have been able to produce a Maimonides. But the integration of Al-Andalus within the Mediterranean world, the close connections of the Jewish community with other Jewish and non-Jewish communities, and Maimonides' own Mediterranean biography combined together to shape the person who came to be known as the Great Eagle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Strunza, for this broad survey of Maimonides' life and fascinating lecture and meeting the time schedule. Thank you so much. So the last speaker in this session is Philip Ackerman Lieberman, a professor of Jewish Studies and Law at Vanderbilt University. He is a historian of medieval Jewry, particularly Jews in Muslim lands. His research focuses on the social, economic, and legal history of the Jewish community of North Africa and the Levant. He serves on the advisory board of the Cairo Geniza project at Princeton University. He is an editor and contributor to the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World, edited by Professor Norman Stillman. His book, The Business of Identity, Jews, Muslims, and Economic Life in Medieval Egypt, was published in 2014. I would also like to point out two fascinating articles he has authored. The first, titled What Historians Can Yield from Medieval Jewish Commercial Contracts, published in 2015. And the second, titled Legal Pluralism Among the Court Records of Medieval Egypt. This article was published in 2014. Professor Lieberman, the Zoom is yours.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to follow our two fabulous speakers. I hope that I will bring some of what you've heard so far together in an entertaining way, and you know, I hope that, you know, in a way they've kind of laid the groundwork for some of what I'm going to do. With the exception of Jesus of Nazareth, Moses Maimonides is probably the Jew about whom the largest number of biographies has been composed. His historical figure brings together the political savvy of Henry Kissinger or Joe Lieberman with the legal mind of Merrick Garland or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the medical expertise of Jonas Salk, and the psychological insights of Daniel Kahneman, with the scientific genius of Niels Bohr or Albert Einstein, and the philosophical creativity of Jacques Derrida or Ludwig Wittgenstein. Yet thinking of the great eagle simply as a great man, as Thomas Carlyle would have us understand history, misses the point that Maimonides himself lived in a turbulent time and made his way, as we've heard, from Córdoba to Fez to the land of Israel and eventually to Egypt, blown by the winds of war, a product of the broader forces shaping the medieval Islamic and medieval Mediterranean world of the 12th century. With this in mind, the figure of Maimonides presents us with an ideal focal point for toppling popular conceptions of the medieval period as the Dark Ages and as the Jews as marginalized within the medieval world. If, as Salo W. Barone has explained, popular Jewish historians have seized upon the medieval Islamic world, and particularly Muslim Spain, as providing a context for Jewish cultural, literary, communal, and even political efflorescence, Maimonides personifies the imagined convivencia even more than figures such as Chastai ibn Shaprut or Samuel ibn Agrella, depicted in Eliyahu Ashtor's 1973 Jews of Muslim Spain. Maimonides is well known not only as a scholar and indeed a polymath whose brilliance transcended cultural, religious, and communal barriers, but as a tireless communal leader who directed his talents in the service of his community and in the service of God. His efforts in the latter domain have made Maimonides a figure of perennial interest to traditional Jews, both because of the controversies raised by his writings and because of their very clarity, accessibility, and comprehensiveness. Now, for all these reasons and more, the life of Maimonides has long captured the imagination of Jews and Muslims alike. We may say that the earliest biographies appear in the Middle Ages itself, from within the Arabic tradition of biographical dictionaries. Jewish writings about Maimonides the man picks up in the 18th, 19th century as Jewish Enlightenment thinkers seized upon him as a focus of their writings. But the rise of social history in the early decades of the 20th century saw a shift as the documentary materials of the Geniza provided an additional entree into the life of a figure as well known to a broad audience as any from his world. In light of the Geniza, devotees of Leopold von Ranke may write about what happened in a way that nonetheless piques the interest of Carlyle's intellectual descendants, who remain interested in great individuals, just as philosophers may write about Maimonides in a way that also happens to pique the interest of devotees of Jewish law. In my talk today, I'd like to introduce a project I'm currently working on, a graphic novel about the life of the Great Eagle, and explain what the project has to contribute to the well-furrowed ground of such biographies. As James Robinson explains in his brief bibliographical survey of biographies of Maimonides, Joel Kramer's 2008 Maimonides, The Life of One of Civilization's Greatest Minds, you can see that on the lower left there, is the only full, detailed social, political, cultural, and intellectual biography of Maimonides that exploits all the relevant sources, including the extensive documentary evidence available in the Cairo Geniza. Kramer contextualizes each stage in Maimonides' life within the world that formed him. Robinson explains that the bibliographical tradition includes a wide variety of approaches, some of which do focus on Maimonides' social and intellectual context, but others attend most closely to Maimonides' philosophical ideas, to his writings, or to the relationship between Jewish philosophy, science, and law. For most of these studies, then, we might channel J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. As Robinson notes, the major contribution in Kramer's magisterial volume is connecting the dots between the literary and quotidian literary text and quotidian context. How did that David Copperfield kind of crap shape the life, outlook, and writings of the master? As a social historian myself, it is Kramer's approach that I find most captivating, but as I will explain, it is in the wake of a decade-long foray away from the quotidian and into Maimonides' philosophical work that sparked my own interest in composing a graphic novel telling the story of Maimonides' life. But first, let me explain why I think this particular subject lends itself to the form of a graphic novel. About 7 years ago, I was invited by Oxford University Press to provide some peer review feedback for a graphic novel by Nina Caputo of the University of Florida and the graphic artist Liz Clark called Debating Truth, which concerned the disputation of Barcelona of 1263 between Moses ben Nachman and a convert to Christianity commonly known as Pablo Cristiani. Since I've been teaching Jews, Christians, and Muslims in medieval Spain for a while, this was a perfect book for me to think about in terms of its readability and its presentation to students of an important moment in Jewish history. But what I actually found most interesting, most exciting about Caputo and Clark's manuscript was not their graphic retelling of the disputation, but rather the background material that was included in the volume discussing the broader context of the disputation and the various source materials historians have used to tell the story of the disputation. In fact, this was not Clark's first foray into this genre. She illustrated Abina and the Important Men in 2011, which told the tale of a West African woman who was wrongfully enslaved and subsequently took her former master to court. Like Debating Truth, Abina was based largely on a contemporary manuscript from 1876. The volume also included additional material discussing historical context, historiography, and providing further references. Nor was Debating Truth Clark's first work of Jewish history. Her Mendoza the Jew was published in 2014, telling the story of heavyweight boxing champion Daniel Mendoza and delving into the rise of boxing as much as the place of Sephardic Jews in 18th century Britain. Reviewing the latter, David D. of De Montfort University described the book as an inspiring introduction to the art and craft of history and a demystifier of the discipline. The graphic novel then should be seen as a tool not only to retell a story, but also to engage questions of historiography. The latter is often a matter of little interest to undergraduates and popular readers alike, and yet at the same time, it overwhelmingly captivates scholars. A substantial part of the work of historians involves thinking about not only what the sources say, but what they mean. Graphic novels presenting a narrative and then reflecting on how the team of author and illustrator got to that narrative can be very rich. With this in mind, I got in touch about a year ago with the artist Christian John Purcell, who illustrated one of the other volumes in the same series at Oxford University Press, to which Liz Clark had contributed. And I asked him if he would be interested in working with me on a biography of Maimonides. Purcell's volume Doom Towns retold the history of atomic testing, not from the perspective of global politics, but rather from the primary sources that illuminated the lives of those who participated in, protested against, or were directly affected by atomic testing during the Cold War. Purcell's attention to the lives of what we might call ordinary individuals particularly attracted me, as well as his background as a museum curator and a historian of art. Although this project would take Purcell into a period fully 8 centuries before and thousands of miles away from the figures he depicted in Doomtowns, he was excited about the project, and amidst all the other projects that the two of us have underway, we're going to put this one together as well. Now, deciding to move forward with the project raised an interesting set of questions for us. While it was pretty clear what I wanted to present in the material beyond the graphic novel itself, that is Maimonides' Islamic context and the historiographic questions concerning the various materials we have to tell the story of Maimonides' life, those are well-trod territory, and all this material lent itself to a combined presentation incorporating text and images, right? Purcell and I were uncertain as to how we wanted to present the story of the great eagle's life. Would it be through his efforts to unify philosophy and Jewish law, as David Hartman has suggested, or through his writings, as Herbert Davidson has suggested, or through his Islamic philosophical context, as Sarah Strumbus has presented the story? After engaging David Tzvi Kalman, a scholar and the driving force behind a small printing house named Printocraft, which published a graphic rendition of the Mishnaic tractate Pirkei Avot, styled A Novel of Jewish Ethics, which had ended up on my bookshelves, Purcell and I opted for a unique way of retelling the story of Maimonides' life. I'd met Purcell just as I was starting to bring to a close the partnership of over a decade working with the Vanderbilt philosopher Len Goodman on a new translation of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, which we've just submitted to Stanford University Press. As Goodman and I puzzled out how to introduce this text to our readers, we opted for an approach that drew on our strengths coming from two entirely different disciplines. I composed a historian's introduction to the guide, which told the story of the guide itself, its forebears, its composition, its reception, and so forth, while Goodman composed a philosopher's introduction to the guide. Now, one moment. Along the way, Goodman pointed out the influence of Maimonides' historical experience on his philosophical writing. And as I considered how to tell the story of Maimonides' life in the graphic novel, I realized that it could be told through vignettes that called to mind the philosophical questions that are present in the guide itself. Hartman aimed for a synthesis between Maimonides as jurist and Maimonides as philosopher, rejecting the widely held position of Leo Strauss and his devotees that Maimonides, the philosopher, rejected some of the fundamentals of Jewish traditionalism, even if that rejection was disguised as golden apples overlaid with silver. But Purcell and I could aim for a different synthesis between Maimonides, the philosopher, and Maimonides, the human being. Now, that is not to say that the guide will provide us with all the signposts for Maimonides' life, only that we hope to make the story of his life clearer by bringing to light some of the philosophical issues that he writes about in the guide. Indeed, it's difficult to read the master's famous letter from 1185 describing his reaction to his brother's death and his shipwreck in 1170 without thinking about his disquisition on the suffering of innocence in Guide 3:17. Thus, by highlighting a number of questions he proceeds to engage in writing the guide, Purcell and I can connect the dots of significant events and present vignettes that conjure up the events that Maimonides himself may well have thought to have been formative in his life. One moment, please. Sorry about that. Let me get back to another one here. At times, this requires conjecture on our part, but not always. When pointing out the underlying purpose of the Torah's commandments concerning marital relations in Guide 349, Maimonides explains that a woman's dowry is deemed the same as wages. There's no difference between withholding it and refusing a man his pay, no difference between finding fault with the worker to dismiss him unpaid and doing so to a woman to divorce her without paying her dowry. Here, it seems that Maimonides has in mind a matter that came before him in the court for which he used strikingly similar language in a responsum to prevent an unscrupulous husband from doing exactly what he mentions in the guide. We may see then the very same concerns and the very same questions He faced in his life as a jurist and a communal leader, surfacing in his philosophical magnum opus. By examining a section of the guide dedicated to vindicating biblical law, we see in Maimonides' life a theme, calling upon justice to avoid abuse and perversion of the law. The other way Purcell and I wish to go farther than the other graphic novels is to see the various parts of the volume we are working on together as a connected whole. There's no reason that our discussion of sources and historiography needs to be restricted to text on the page. Indeed, the colorful history of the Cairo Geniza and even the discovery of primary source materials for the writing of medieval Jewish history generally, think for instance of projects of scholars such as Judith Osobi-Schlanger, finding books within the bindings of other books, as you see here, lends itself to illustration no less than the lives of the figures we wish to represent with that history. In short, historians are part of the story too, and Purcell and I will depict that. Finally, my presentation would not be complete without showing you a couple of the elementary sketches Purcell has already prepared based on our conversations and his exploration of architecture from the 11th and 12th centuries. Some of these sites are easily recognizable and are even extant, say the Great Mosque of Córdoba, but for others we'll have to draw on contemporary architecture, textiles, objets d'art in various museum collections, and of course, descriptions in the Geniza documents. Although this project is still in its infancy, I hope that this work will be able to reach beyond some of the traditional audiences for our scholarship, while still presenting material that experts in the field will find interesting, enlightening, and useful in their research and teaching. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lieberman, for this, what looks like a fascinating endeavor. I wish you, of course, all success and looking forward to reading your imaginative, I guess, kind of Maimonides' life and the context of all this. Thank you so much. We still have, first, I'm glad to see that Magda Harun, president of the Jewish community in Cairo, has joined us. The technical issue that prevented her from joining in at the beginning of the session was resolved, thanks God. Welcome, Magda. We do have some time for a few questions. I already have here two. The one, I guess, might be addressed by the three distinguished speakers. So please, if you want to join into this and answer, you're most welcome. The question goes like this. It says something like that. I cannot understand why the rabbi of the Cairan community permitted the removal of the Geniza so that thousands of its documents are spread worldwide in Cambridge, Princeton, and other institutions. A kind of a provocative first question.
I would actually like to suggest that we defer the question to Rebecca Jefferson, who will be able to answer it, I think, better than anyone currently living.
That's a brilliant idea. Thanks for that.
I agree. I completely agree. I don't know if Rebecca is, I cannot see the whole
is willing. Sorry to put you on the spot, Rebecca.
No, I'm absolutely willing.
To
We hold it
Rebecca?
for, I'm absolutely willing, but maybe we hold it for the next session. So
in fact, it's a very good idea, because the next session will deal in part, at least, with this broad context of the Geniza location today. I have another question, and this is about how life in Fustat or Cairo influenced Maimonides' thought. Presumably, in addition to being influenced by Aristotelian thought or an Islamic philosophical tradition, he must have been influenced by decades of life in this Islamic society of Egypt.
May I say a word on that?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Professor Stumser.
Not specifically about his life in Egypt, but about his life in the Islamicate world. I think it's important. Your question is important in that it draws attention to the fact that although Goitein spoke about symbiosis, and we imagine that in some parts of his life, Maimonides was connected to the Islamic culture, for example, in philosophy, but in everything else, he lived within a bubble of the Jewish community, except when he went to the hospital or to work. I think your question wakes us to the fact that every aspect of his writing and his life, including his writing on Jewish legal material, including the way he lived as a Jew, was affected, was influenced by the fact that he lived within a Muslim diverse society. So we will not have time to go into this, but we can see how his legal decisions are sometimes not only expressed in terms of fiqh in Arabic, but also are affected by the way the different Muslim schools decide on matters. And we can see how, for example, his attitude to women is sometimes influenced by the way it is women were treated at that period, at that area where he lived. So yes, I think it is something that we must bear in mind all the time, that he never lived within a bubble. This was the Jewish Maimonides within the Islamic society.
Great.
But
yes, please.
I want to weigh on this for a moment, Professor Strumsad, but I couldn't agree with you more. But I think that the question was also about how the Egyptian context might have differed from the Sephardic context. And from the very beginning of your talk, you importantly pointed out that Maimonides self-identifies as Sephardi, and therefore there is I think that he sees a broad appreciation of philosophy, of the sciences, of medicine as like a kind of a cultural imperative that he ascribes to that Sephardi, Spanish context. And I think that he feels that he's in a different environment in Egypt, and that is part of why, as you said, he doesn't just identify himself as a Sephardi to point out where he's from, as opposed to everybody else, but it is it is how he sees himself culturally. So I mean, you can maybe flesh that a little.
Yeah, but I think that although he definitely carried with him the Sephardi or Andalusi identification, we can see in the autographs of his commentary on the Mishnah, on which he continued to work throughout his life. We can see him sometimes adding, for example, there is a term in Arabic, and then he says, yes, but in Egypt it is called differently. So when he adapts or he listens to the Egyptian environment at the same time.
Great. We have a question to you, Professor Lieberman, and this is about, I guess, readership. Who do you see as the primary audience for your graphic novel, and does that shape how you are approaching this?
For sure. Yeah, I think one has to see multiple overlapping audiences for one's work, or else one is, certain never to be able to do more than buy dinner with one's royalties. As I said, the figure of Maimonides is kind of a perennial interest, and that is, not only to scholars, to undergraduates, but there also is a popular audience out there, and I am hoping that that the graphic novel will be able to bring, as I said, some of the questions of historiography to a broader undergraduate audience. It will bring detail of the Islamic context to people who would not necessarily ordinarily think about Maimonides as an Islamic thinker. So, I'm hoping, as I said, because of the, perennial traditionalist interest in that, traditional Jews will be interested in this. But, if you look at other corresponding graphic novels about other famous rabbinic figures, they're universally pretty bad. My wife is a scholar of Rashi, whom Professor Strumsa mentioned, and one of her students once got her the comic book about Rashi called Rashi HaKadosh, which is just terrible. And so I'm trying to do better than Rashi HaKadosh, but I nonetheless think that folks who will who might buy books like that, kind of hagiography, will nonetheless be interested in that. So I'm hoping that there will be some traditional interest in it, as well as some of our colleagues who might want a compelling presentation of historiographical questions, and folks who are not Jewish historians, whether they are Islamic historians or philosophers who are interested in some of the issues that Maimonides is wrestling with. And the fact is that the genre of graphic novel really has been developing, such that there are some new offerings in the field of economics and other social science fields. So I hope this will kind of join that and be of broad interest.
Okay, we will join you with this hope. I will take the last question, and this is about Maimonides' opinion, attitudes towards the Karaite community in Fustat. Would you try to address this, Professor Rusto?
Yeah, so basically the short answer is mixed, which is to say that on the one hand, there were many ways in which Maimonides, like everybody else in the Jewish community, accepted the Karaites as an integral part of the Jewish community. And then there were certain limits in Jewish law beyond which he couldn't go. For example, accepting the Karaite divorce document as being valid, which created big problems in rabbinic law. So I would say, like much else you see in the relationships between Karaites and Rabbinites as a group in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of paradox. So a lot of, everyday, just completely normal daily life like you'd expect anywhere else. And then there were certain hard limits that people, couldn't get around. There's been a little bit of more recent research on this, which I have not yet read. So the answer to this question could change soon.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you all. These were some very fascinating presentations, and I think we established here a very strong opening for the next sessions today and tomorrow. So thank you so much, Marina, Sarah, Phil. Was wonderful having you in this session. I hope you stay with us for the next ones. We will take a break of 5 minutes, and then we resume with the next session, as I said, exactly in 5 minutes. So thank you all. See you soon. Masar al-Khair again, good evening. I'm delighted to introduce the moderator and the speaker of the next session, Dr. Rebecca Jefferson. Rebecca is the curator of the Esser and Ray Price Library of Judaica at the University of Florida, and a joint faculty member of the Center for Jewish Studies. Prior to moving to Florida, she worked on the bibliography project in the Taylor Schechter Geniza Research Unit in Cambridge University Library. She has since published numerous articles on the history and provenance of the Cairo Geniza collections. In 2018, she published a thought-provoking article titled, "What Else There Is Still Beneath? The Multiple Dimensions of the Cairo Genizot," in plural, Genizot, in which she deconstructs both the conception of the Cairo Geniza and the Schechter-centric narrative that we all familiar with. Her book, The Cairo Geniza and the Age of Discovery in Egypt, is due for publication in January 2022. We are looking forward, of course, to see this very promising study. The title of her lecture today is The Cairo Geniza Unearthed, and I will stop here and just transfer the mic to you, Rebecca, to moderate the next session.
Thank you so much, Yoram. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Drop of Milk Association, to Magda Haroun, to Sami Ibrahim, to Yoram, and to Nisreen, and as well to all the other conference organizers and supporters and participants. I'm so excited to be in Cairo for the first time in my life, even though it's only virtually in Cairo. So thank you for including me in your wonderful program. I am so honored to be on this panel with two very distinguished speakers, Professor Mohammed Abul-Gar and Professor Mohammed Hawari. Our session will look at three different aspects of Egyptian Jewish history. My own paper looks at the foreigners who came to Egypt to despoil the community's genizot, and why they did so, and how it affects our understanding of community history. Professor Mohammed Hawari's paper will look at a great Egyptian Jew, Moses Maimonides, and how he affected and influenced Jewish life elsewhere, specifically in Yemen, through his famous epistle to Yemen. And Professor Mohammed Abul-Gar will look at modern Egyptian Jewish life, at the external and internal influences and pressures brought to bear on the community, leading to its eventual dispersion. So first of all, I will start with me, and I'll just get my PowerPoint going. I'll share my screen. Okay. Hopefully bring that PowerPoint around. Oops. There. And start it off. There. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So on this first slide, you can see some photographs of some of the known protagonists in the Cairo Geniza story. They are individuals who either collected or sold Geniza fragments. They are too numerous to cover in 15 minutes. And so I will tell you about some of them, what they were hunting for, and why examining their stories matter through the lens of one particular text. In July 1896, Adolf Neubauer, scholar and curator of Hebraica at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, published some Egyptian fragments. By that time, he'd been collecting fragments for 6 years, and he was behind a secret plan to acquire fragments found in 1895 in an underground chamber near the Ben Ezra synagogue. He was frustrated by the fact that other scholars and collectors were publishing fragments without providing their source, or worse, hoarding fragments and preventing the recovery of important texts. We also see that Neubauer was keenly engaged in the race to write the history of the Jews of Egypt. The Egyptian fragments that Neubauer published were pieces of a composition known as the Megillat Zuta. The Megillah Zuta Harasha, scroll of the evil Zuta, was composed by the medieval Jewish Egyptian poet Avraham ben Hillel. He wrote the piece in 1196 to celebrate getting rid of an unpopular leader, Sar Shalom Yahya ben Moses Halevi. Sar Shalom was dubbed Zuta, the little one, by Ben Hillel, who was a staunch supporter of Zuta's rival, Moses Maimonides. The scroll also celebrated Maimonides being reinstated as the community's leader, or Nagid. The composition first came to light in 1886 when Avraham Eliyahu Hakavi, the Russian scholar and librarian, published a version based on 4 fragments. Hakavi did not divulge where they came from, but his work with the second Firkovich collection suggests that this was the source. The second Firkovich collection had been amassed by the Russian Karaite Avraham Firkovich. Starting in the 1830s, Firkovich had stumbled upon the fact that manuscript treasures was to be found in Genizot. In the 1860s, he went on a collecting mission in the Near East based out of Jerusalem. In 1864, he collected thousands of fragments from the Karaite synagogue in Cairo, and according to his own testimony, was preparing to open the, or a, Geniza in the Ben Ezra synagogue. His mission was halted, possibly due to a lack of funds, but nevertheless, the fragments he brought home, although mostly from Cairo, were also mixed up with fragments from other locations. Adolf Neubauer's edition of Megillat Zuta expanded on Hakavi's version. Neubauer was the first person to use the text to try to reconstruct the history of Egyptian leadership, particularly the office or honorific title of Nagid. There are fragments revealed more about Moses Maimonides' role in leading the community and where he and his son Avraham Maimonides stood in the line of succession. One of Neubauer's Zuta fragments had arrived in the Bodleian in 1891 from the collector Greville John Chester. Starting in the 1860s, Chester spent every winter in Egypt exploring the country and collecting antiquities for the British Museum. By the late 1880s, he was known as an expert in the field. In December 1889, he was one of the first people to see the renovations being carried out on the Ben Ezra synagogue, and he may have been one of the first to see a geniza inside the synagogue suddenly laid open. He hurriedly wrote to the Bodleian librarian to tell him about the discovery and sent him some fragments. He swore him to secrecy and promised to send several batches more. When Chester returned to Cairo for the following winter season, he established a source for the supply of Geniza fragments. While staying in Cairo, he received multiple packages and he mailed them off in batches to hide them from customs. Part of his winter season was spent on a Nile boat traveling up the Nile, and on his return to Cairo, he would send more packages. In addition to the Zuta piece he sent in 1891, there were works of the type and age one might expect to find in an old Egyptian geniza. But also included were a few items that one might not expect, such as this Siddur of the German Rite, which suggests that maybe his dealer mixed in a few pieces from other sources. Neubauer's other fragment of Zuta came to the Bodleian through the Jerusalem-based dealer Solomon Aaron Wertheimer. Wertheimer was a self-supporting scholar and self-taught expert in deciphering manuscripts. When fragments started to come his way in the late 1880s, he was excited to read and publish them. But to support his family, he had to sell off the manuscripts. His first sales to the Bodleian took place in 1892. He did not divulge to Neubauer that he'd already published the Zuta piece. So Neubauer also used his article to reprimand Wertheimer and to point out his errors in reproducing the text. Wertheimer additionally supplied fragments to other collectors. Through his correspondence with the Cambridge reader in rabbinics, Solomon Schechter, he offered pieces to Cambridge University Library. He was in correspondence with the London-based scholar and future Sephardi chief rabbi, Moses Gaster, who was amassing his own private library. Gaster's method of collecting was to ask agents on the ground, like Wertheimer, to gather up large bundles of manuscripts, and he would take them sight unseen. Wertheimer did not divulge his own sources, but in 2 letters to Cambridge University Library, he offered a Sefer Torah from one of the Genizas of Old Egypt. Another private letter also reveals that he had at least one person bringing him sacks of fragments from Cairo in 1893. However, a close examination of the items he sold to Oxford and Cambridge also shows that, again, other materials, perhaps from the Jerusalem markets, were mixed up in his consignments. One example is this fragmentary copy of a Kabbalistic prayer dated 1893. Since the author of the piece was based in a Jerusalem yeshiva, and since the date is rather late for it to have been placed in the Geniza of the Ben Ezra synagogue, it would seem to have come from another source. Nevertheless, when it was catalogued, it was described with the other fragments as from the Geniza. In 1896, Wertheimer sent Neubauer a first leaf of the Megillat Zuta. This fragment was in a different hand and represented a third version of the text. Perhaps the worry that Neubauer's public reprimand would affect his sales is what impelled him to send it to Oxford. Neubauer quickly published a version to follow up next year in 1897. 2 years later, in 1899, Neubauer's assistant, the Semitic scholar and future Bodleian librarian Arthur Ernest Cowley, published a short notice in the Jewish Quarterly Review that 2 additional fragments of the Megillat Zuta had been acquired by the Bodleian. They represented another 2 versions of the text, and Cowley commented that this was proof of the text's popularity amongst the Egyptian Jews. Nevertheless, Cowley did not specify any information about how they got them, only that they had lately arrived. It is possible that they arrived at the Bodleian thanks to the efforts of another agent on the ground, the mysterious Count Riamo Dulst. Dulst was a long-time resident in Cairo. In the 1880s, he'd been employed by the Egyptian Exploration Fund on archaeological excavations. In December 1889, like Greville Chester, he stumbled upon Hebrew fragments in the environs of the old Roman fortress, and he sent them to the Egypt Exploration Fund. The fund then sent them on to the Bodleian in 1890. In 1892, Neubauer's friend, the Oxford scholar Archibald Henry Sayce, commissioned Dulst to find the source of the fragments. He found some in 1893, and then in March 1895, Sayce informed Neubauer that Dulst had found the source in a subterranean place. By November 1895, Sayce told him that, at last, the manuscripts were coming in, suggesting that they were being moved from an underground place to somewhere indoors. Dulst sent over a large box of fragments to the Bodleian Library in December 1895. Neubauer's antagonist, the Austrian scholar David Kaufmann, was a major private collector. His impressive collection included a sumptuous medieval copy of Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. He was also one of the first to publish a Geniza fragment from the Archduke Rainer collection, acquired through the dealer Otto Theodor Graf. In December 1894, just around the time when Dulst was inquiring after the Geniza fragments, and on the eve of his underground discovery, Kaufmann acquired his own box of fragments that he marked as being from Geniza in an Egyptian synagogue. Kaufmann never divulged his source. One of his known suppliers, however, was his friend Mordechai Adelman. Adelman, who was a Lithuanian-born Viennese collector, later settled in Palestine. In the 1880s, he sent manuscripts to Kaufmann, including fragments from a Jerusalem Geniza. Discoveries of palimpsests by their scholarly friends in Oxford and Cambridge prompted the twin sister scholar adventurers Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson to travel to Egypt. In early 1896, cholera was raging throughout Egypt, and yet they risked contracting it just to see what they could find. The knock-on effect of their activities, i.e. that Solomon Schechter was able to identify a fragment of Ben Sira in their sack of fragments, and that led him to the discovery of the Cairo Geniza, is now a well-known story. However, there are still details missing. The twins obscured the origins of their sack of fragments, saying very little about how or where exactly they obtained them. One sack, they claim, came from Egypt, and yet they spent barely any time there because of the cholera. The other sack, they claimed, came from a dealer in the plain of Sharon. Another private collector on the prowl was Elkan Nathan Adler. He was a lawyer and son and brother of two of England's chief rabbis. He'd become an avid collector, and his connections opened many doors. When he first visited the Cairo Jewish community in 1888, he was told that the Genizot were regularly emptied and buried. Early in 1896, however, having heard the rumors, he was given permission to take a sack of fragments from the Ben Ezra synagogue. Adler kept curiously quiet about the chamber itself and surprisingly hardly ever described it. Yet he eagerly shared his fragment discoveries with his scholarly friends in order to gain their help in deciphering them, including several pieces pertaining to medieval Egyptian Jewish leaders. He shared the news with Neubauer, with Schechter, and with Kaufmann. Schechter in particular paid very close attention to Adler's collection, and the damp smell of the fragments connected them to the pieces that the twin sisters had brought to his attention. I won't repeat the Schechter story here because it's so well known, but it is important to note that Schechter not only emptied the Geniza chamber in the Ben Ezra synagogue, he also acquired fragments from other Genizot in Cairo, including the Basatine cemetery, and he acquired pieces from the Cairo markets and during a trip to Palestine. Although not huge numbers, it's worth bearing in mind that fragments from other sources were mixed into his hoard of Hebrew manuscripts. Thanks to an article published by David Kaufmann in 1896, in which he gave the first history of the Geniza, and an article published by Schechter in 1897 relaying the news of his discoveries in the Ben Ezra synagogue, the Geniza provenance became a sought-after commodity. Other collectors were able to acquire fragments through another dealer in Jerusalem, Samuel Raphaeli Rafalovich. Raphaeli, as he was known in Palestine, was an expert coin collector and later recognized for his work in museum development. To the foreign collectors, he was known as Rafalovich, a somewhat shady-seeming dealer. In the period 1898 to 1899, he sold fragments to Cambridge through Solomon Schechter, to the British Museum, to Moses Gaster, to Elkan Nathan Adler, and to Israel Levy for the Consistoire Israélite de Paris. Meanwhile, in Cairo, the Count d'Ulst had been secretly employed by Adolf Neubauer to excavate in the area where he first found fragments in 1889. He eventually dug up 16 large grain sacks full of fragments, which were shipped off to Oxford. Neubauer rejected them and sold them off to a gentleman collector, who turned out to be Elkan Nathan Adler. Meanwhile, another Cairo resident, Reginald Q. Enrique, a businessman from Manchester, who worked closely with some of Cairo's leading Jewish families, was helping Schechter. When sacks of fragments continued to surface, he confiscated them in order to prevent d'Ulst from acquiring them. He sent them all on to Cambridge, 6 sacks and 3 bags. With fragments circulating from many quarters at the end of the 1890s, it is perhaps no wonder that Cowley forgot the source of the 2 versions of Zuta lately acquired. After they were acquired, The other versions were removed from their former bindings, and all 5 fragmentary versions were bound up together and reclassified as manuscript Heb A82. Doesn't move forward for some reason. Oh, there we go. I didn't want to move forward. Neubauer's eyesight was failing him in the late 1890s, and by the turn of the century, he had to retire from his position. He'd compiled descriptions for about half of the Bodleian's Geniza collection, and Cowley completed the rest. The catalogue was published in 1906. By the time it came out, the Megillat fragments were simply listed as from the Geniza, 1891, 1895, 1896, and their suppliers' names omitted. By this time, the label from the Geniza, i.e. synonymous with the Ben Ezra Synagogue Geniza, was deemed sufficient provenance. But today there are 54 institutions and 18 private individuals, at least, with Geniza fragment collections. Many of their source stories are still unknown, and many of the collections came about in uncertain ways and with other materials getting supply.
In ways.
Even though we must be truly thankful that the Cairo Geniza has yielded so many treasures, including a wealth of information about Maimonides, the full story of how and where the Geniza fragments were found and how they were taken out of Egypt has yet to be unearthed. That's me done. All right, stop share. And bring that up.
Well, it never will be unearthed, right?
maybe part of it. Okay, and now we should move on with the rest of our session. If you can just give me a moment to pull up my notes. All right, okay, so I'm honored to introduce the second speaker in our session, Professor Mohammed Abulghar. Professor Abulghar is an eminent obstetrician at the University of Cairo, specializing in IV fertility research, and he has authored many important papers in that field. In addition, Professor Abulghar is a political activist who has demanded the democratization of Egyptian universities. He helped found the Egyptian Social Democratic Party, and he serves as a spokesman for the National Association for Change. His independent research has taken him into the world of Egyptian Jewry, and in 2005, he published a wonderful book with Dar El Hilal entitled, I'll just give you the short title due to my lack of Arabic, Yahud Misr, on the Egyptian Jews, the history of Egyptian Jews. Abulghar's work was based on the relevant historic literature, but it brought together a wealth of original material through his in-depth discussions and interviews conducted with Cairo residents, as well as with ex-Egyptian Jews living outside of Egypt. The title of his talk today is Documenting the 20th Century Evolution of Jewish Life in Egypt. And so now I'll hand over to you, Professor Abulghar.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody in Cairo, the Middle East and Europe, and good afternoon for people in America. My talk is introducing or discussing the Egyptian Jews in the 20th century. I shall just share my slides now. What is this?
I think if you go into slideshow,
Yes, I'm looking to slideshow, but I don't find it in the...
it's along the top there. If you look at the top, it says File, Home, Insert. Do you see along the top? And then you go to slideshow. Just above where it says Enable Editing.
Strange. So I just tried it in the morning and it worked, yes.
We can see it, we just need to
Yeah.
see the slideshow version.
Okay. Sorry for this.
If you enable editing, there you go.
That's got it. You've got
Jews lived in Egypt for several centuries before Christ. They immigrated from Spain in the 15th century, and in the 19th century, they immigrated from the Ottoman Empire, and in the 20th century, there is a wave of immigration from Eastern Europe. Egyptian Jews are from various ethnic, cultural, economic, and social backgrounds, and they spoke different languages. So generalization is impossible for description of the life of Egyptian Jews. The Jewish life in Egypt, I could divide it into three periods. The golden period, which is from the turn of the 20th century till just before the Second World War, and the period of prosperity and worry between the beginning of the Second World War and 1948, and then the critical period, which was followed by dispersion of the Jews between 48 and 67. This is the population of Egypt and the number of Jews. So the biggest number was in 1947. According to the census of Egypt, was 65,000 Egyptian Jews, but in reality, most of historians speaking about 75, 80, and even some people, they raise it to up to 100,000 people. In the first half or more, first 4 decades of the 20th century, the Jews were very prosperous in business in Egypt in different forms, in industry, transportation, railways, different types of factories, sugar refineries, big stores in Egypt, and suburbs in Cairo, Maadi, and in Alexandria, Samuha. And there are famous, very famous and very rich families in Egypt, like the Korail family, Sawaris, Kattawi. This is in Cairo, and in Alexandria we have other types, other people, and other very famous families like Musiri, etc. The Egyptian Jews were about less than 0.5% of the population of Egypt. They controlled 1/3 of all shareholding registered companies. That is in 1944. They reinvested their profits in new companies in Egypt, which helped to boost the economy. In the second half of the 40s, most of the rich Jews sold their assets when they felt instability of the situation in Egypt. A large section of the Jews belonged to different strata of the middle class who enjoyed a decent, comfortable life. And then we have the poor Jews who lived in Haret el-Yahud with a limited education and lived in the Jewish quarters. In the golden period, the Jews had complete religious freedom. Large number of synagogues, around 55 synagogues were present in Egypt, and they were built in Cairo, Alexandria, Tanta in Delta, Mahal al-Kubra in Delta, also mostly in Delta and the north part of Egypt, and very few in the southern part of Egypt. Plus, there were several private synagogues in the gardens of rich Jewish families in Egypt, and they had to collect friends or some people from the Jewish quarter to make the number necessary for the prayers. During this golden period, Jews were also involved in political life. They supported Arabi revolution, a sort of revolution, or nationalist movement in 1881. The Jews of Alexandria, again, they supported him. Yusuf Aslan Qaradawi was an elected member in the Egyptian parliament, later became a minister, member of the Senate and Minister of Finance and Minister of Communication. Castro was an assistant to Saad Zaghloul, the great Egyptian leader of 1919 revolution. Again, the Jews participated very actively in the 1919 revolution. It was a secular movement, and the Jews were invited and joined. And there are several names like David Hazan, Leon Castro, Flex Benkazin, who joined the Wafd party, the majority party, the very popular party in Egypt. And they were also represented in the committee which drafted the first modern constitution of Egypt in 1923, and that was Aslan Qaradawi. And they had also excellent relations with the minority parties, which included the intellectual Egyptians. During this golden period, they participated in the social work, NGOs. They were active in sports, and many of them represented Egypt in the Olympic Games in 1920, 24, 28, 32, and even in 36 in Berlin also. And some were members of the Egyptian national team of basketball, which won the 3rd place in the World Cup in 1950. Jews had an excellent relation with King Fuad and his family, and they had a good relation with Al-Azhar Sheikhs, Azhar University, and also with the Pope of the Copts. The gradual decline in Arabic language among upper and middle class of the Jewish population started to occur in the late 30s. The grandfather used to speak Arabic at work and at home, although he knew other languages. The father spoke Arabic at work with workers and French or Italian at home. The sons spoke only broken Arabic with workers and servants, and gradually, most of them, they lost their Arabic. This is a PhD study from Australia. Raquel Barda, she immigrated Egyptian immigrants from Egypt to Australia, and the census in Egypt showed that only 35% of the Jews who spoke good Arabic, 65% they spoke moderate or very poor or no Arabic at all. Better Arabic language was better in low socioeconomic classes because they was dealing with ordinary people all the time. The rich people started to be isolated. Young immigrants were poor in Arabic compared to the older immigrants, which lived the period where they had to speak Arabic. Why did Egyptian Jews neglect Arabic language? Decline of importance of Arabic in the business, which English started, it was French and then shifted to English to become the business language. And they wanted closer relation with European culture. In culture, in the beginning, they were very active. The Jews, Yaqub Sanno, and in the next generation, Murad Farag, masters of the language, they presented really the Egyptian culture. I'm going to speak about them later. Gradually, the influence of the Egyptian Jews on the language and culture faded away. The language and culture continued in the poor, less influential Jews who were really, they gave a good part of the culture in music and singing, and they all came from those poor Egyptian there who spoke the Arabic. Now we have to the very sensitive and important Egyptian nationality issue. Jews holding Egyptian nationality in 1948 were only 30% of the Egyptian Jews. Jews holding European nationality, they were again 30%, and Jews without nationality were 40%. And another similar study was done on the immigrants of Australia, which showed something similar, very close to this, approximately 1/3 in each part, maybe a little up and a little down. And why the Egyptian Jews didn't have the Egyptian nationality? Before 1929, it was very simple and very easy for anybody resident to Egypt to get the nationality immediately without any problem. The first law for nationality was drafted in 1929. It was a very liberal law and very easy to get the Egyptian nationality. And any Jew who wanted to have nationality would have got it very simply. And after 40, and it continued to be like this till 1945, it started to be more difficult. And after 48, it became more difficult. And although the law was a good law, was a very liberal law, but the Egyptian bureaucracy and the problems occurring in Palestine, there were many people in the government and in the especially law employees who were hostile, and they did not want to help the Egyptian Jews to get their nationality. After 54, it was almost impossible to have an Egyptian nationality, not only because of bureaucracy, but also there was a change in law. Why did the Jews didn't have the Egyptian nationality earlier when it was very easy? Well, there is a desire and hope to acquire the European citizenship. If they have the Egyptian nationality, they will not get any European citizenship. Again, at that time, there was this foreign, from the Ottoman period, this foreign priority for the foreign people living in Egypt. Non-Egyptians had priority. They didn't pay taxes, for example, and they were tried in front of the consul or for the mixed tribunals afterwards. So if you don't have a nationality, you will consider non-Egyptian and you will have these advantages. So, and some of the poor areas didn't apply to become Egyptian simply because of ignorance and negligence, and many of them in that early period were alphabets. But from 45, it was very difficult it started to be difficult and more difficult afterwards. Now, the second period, from 1935-36, the problems started with the Egyptian Jews because of demonstrations supporting Palestinians, 1935-36. Some Egyptian politicians started to be interested in the Palestinian issue, like Aluba Basha, and then Muslim Brotherhood started to be more active, and they were active against Jews, which culminated in the explosion of the Jewish Quarter in 1948. Activities of a small fascistic party, Masr al-Fatah, led by Ahmed Hussein. The prosperity of the Jews continued, but they were worried. The rich sold and left their things, but medium and small businesses continue. And during this period, because of the help with support of the rich Jewish community, the standard of the poor Jews started to improve, and their level of education started to improve. Then the difficult period from 48 till 67, because of the creation of the State of Israel and the 48 war, because Zionist activities in Egypt were accepted in the Golden Age, not prevented during the period of worry, but after 48, it was illegal and punishable. Arrest of Zionist activities for a short period in 48, and then temporary freezing of Zionist assets, which was cancelled shortly afterwards, and finally bombing of the Jewish quarters, and this, of course, created lots of worry. After 48, relations or conditions start to be more normalized, and people became calm. Muslim Brotherhood were banned, but continued to operate under the surface. In 51, the Egyptian government canceled actually in the end of 51, canceled the Anglo-Egyptian treaty by the Egyptian government, and guerrillas warfare started against the British troops in the Suez Canal, and there was a brutal murder of tens of unarmed Egyptian police by the British troop, which ended by lots of demonstration and anger. Finally, most of the center of Cairo was burned in 52, with the shops of everybody, including the Jews, where they had their shops in these areas. And many foreigners and Egyptians, non-Jewish also too. In 52, when the three officers came to power, king was exiled. Naguib, the leader of officers, visited Adli synagogue, assured the Jews about their safety, encouraged them to continue business as normal. The situation calmed down. In 54, there was a problem of the Lavon affair, when the Mossad recruited Egyptian Jews to bomb American buildings because they were worried that Nasser started to be closer to the Americans. I didn't want this to happen. So, and they were arrested. 2 Egyptians, one from Cairo, one from Alexandria, were hanged. Several ones had imprisonment, and the incident created major worries among average Egyptians and made many Jews to be suspected for espionage. The major media campaign made it difficult for the Jews. In 1956, Nasser nationalized Suez Canal. Israel joined Britain and France in the war against Egypt. Egyptian people considered that Israel started an act of aggression for no reason, because she was not involved in the Suez Canal, and the consequences was detention of a number of Jews for short periods, nationalization of the assets of British and French people, not Jewish people, but some of the French and the British people were Jewish. A high degree of panic went through all Jews. Massive media campaign against Britain, France, and Israel. A campaign of Jewish organization, on the other hand, wanted to help frighten Jews and facilitated their that they leave Egypt and immigrate to other countries. So after 56 and during 57, this was a massive immigration of Egypt. So actually there was no law or there was no pressure to expel them, but they were frightened by the media at that time. And what made the problem more exaggerated, that any Jew was leaving, if he is an Egyptian, has an Egyptian passport, they tell him, if you want to leave the country, you have to give up your passport. If you have only a permanent resident, you have to give up your permanent resident. And so they lost their nationality or their resident, and became very difficult for them later to come back. And of course, that was helped by the very, very strong media by Nasser at that time. The medium-sized and small businesses sold the business in a hurry, in a few months or maximum 1 year, of course, at a much less fair price. And the last period, from 57 to 67, now the number of Jews dwindled to a very small number. And in 61, that was the final issue, because Nasser nationalized every business, in every private business in Egypt. Not Jews, but for Muslims, Copts, everybody, Egyptians, non-Egyptian, it doesn't matter. So the people who stayed, because they had still some successful business in Egypt, they had nothing after this. So the number became very little. And after 67, young men were detained in a camp for a period until they all left. The upper class and most of the middle class went to France, United States, Brazil, and Australia. The rest, not the majority, minority, and the poor and the less educated went to Israel. The transformation of Egypt into a modern nation state increasingly destabilized the foundation of Jewish life. The Jews of Egypt had to respond to the dilemmas introduced by modernity with colonialism, liberalism, nationalism, secularism, Arabism, Islamism, communism, and Zionism. And all these ideologies were pulling the fabrics of the society in conflicting directions. They had challenges to their national identity and political forces that eventually forces them to exile. And my last slide, I would like to pay tribute to 5 great Egyptian Jews. Yaqub Sannoh in the 19th century, who was the first Egyptian to start the Egyptian theater, the first troupe of Egyptian theater. He translated lots of plays from Molière, from French to Arabic, and he was exiled by Khidr Ismail to France, and he had his newspaper, Abu Nadara Zar'a, which was very, very important and influential magazine, smuggled to Egypt every week, and he defended the cause of Egypt against the British in France very, very strongly. The second was Murad Farag. He is a lawyer, a poet, and a writer who published many, many books in the first 40 years of the 20th century. Shahata Haroun, he was one of the leaders of the Egyptian Communist Party. He's a lawyer, very famous and well-known lawyer and defendant of liberal ideas and free Egypt. And he is the father of our dear friend, Magda Haroun, the head of the Egyptian Jewish Society. Yusuf Darwish is again, he's a Karit, and he is a Karaite. He is a lawyer who defended the Egyptian workers and fought for them a lot. And finally, my dear friend, the late Albert Arié, who passed away only a few months ago, and he was a great Egyptian who always defended Egypt and freedom in Egypt. And thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Abou-Gar. That was so rich in information, really fascinating. We're going to move now to our third speaker, and it's a great honor to introduce him. It's Professor Mohammed Hawari. Professor Hawari is a faculty member at Ain Shams University, Cairo, where he completed his PhD dissertation in 1983 on the divinity among the children of Israel from the period of Moses until the exile of Babylon. Currently, he is a professor of religious Jewish thought and comparative religions, Department of Hebrew Studies at Ain Shams. His specialized areas of research and teaching include Judaism, biblical studies, comparative religions, Aramaic papyri, Geniza manuscripts, Judeo-Arabic literature and Judeo-Arabic sources in the Cairo Geniza, Hebrew grammar and text, and Syriac grammar and text, to name just a few. Professor Hawari is the author of many important books and articles on these subjects, including The Differences Between the Karaites and the Rabbinites in the Light of the Geniza manuscripts, and The Jewish Polemics Against Christianity in Light of the Cairo Geniza, to list just 2 of them. You can see other examples of his prolific publishing output listed in the conference program. His talk today is entitled Maimonides, Epistle to Yemen. So that's over to you, Professor Hawari.
Thank you very much, Professor Rebecca, for this introducing. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to the organizers, Madam Magda Haroun, Sami Ibrahim, Nisreen, and my old friend, Yoram. My topic is Maimonides' epistle to Yemen. Moses bin Maimun, or Moshe bin Maimun, commonly known as Maimonides, and also referred to by the acronym Rambam for Rabbeinu Moshe bin Maimun. He was born in Córdoba, Al-Moravid Empire on Passover Eve, 1135 or 1138. Actually, he wrote about Moses bin Maimun biography, but I would like to move to the main topic or the subject of his Igeret Teiman. But I would like to refer in his, and before arriving Egypt, I wrote a few lines about his life before arriving Egypt, but I shall refer to one point he referred in it in his Garrett. Some say that it is likely that Maimonides find a conversion to Islam before escaping. This forced conversion was ruled legally invalid under Islamic law when brought up by arrival in Egypt. According to Muslim authorities, the family became formally converted to Islam somewhere in the period between 1150 and 1160. At that time, many Jews had outwardly adopted Islam. The Jews of Yemen had suffered from some disturbances and felt a kind of discrimination and persecution in some period. The middle of the 12th century was quite a dramatic era for the Jews of Yemen. Around 1165, the Jewish community of Yemen was in grave crisis. The Muslim ruler of Yemen, Abd al-Nabi ibn Mahdi, who, unlike the sultans in Egypt, who were Sunnites, belonged to the sectarian Shias, instituted a religious persecution, presented the Jews with a choice: conversion to Islam or death. That forced conversion to Islam threw the Jews into panic. Additionally, their agony was compounded by a Jewish apostate who embraced Mohammedanism, converted to Islam, to demonstrate his zeal for his newly adopted faith. He began preaching to the Jewish communities that Prophet Muhammad, was a divinely sent prophet alluded to into the Old Testament, and that Islam was a new divinely revered religion superseding Judaism. Hence, the apostate argued the Jews should yield to the ruler's demand and embrace Mohammedanism. Moreover, a Yemenite Jew began proclaiming that he was the long-awaited Messiah. This man, who claimed to be Israel's Messiah, began preaching a syncretistic religion that combined Judaism and Islam, and claimed that the Old Testament had foretold his coming as a prophet. This campaign, conducted by a convert to Islam to win them to his new faith, coupled with a messianic movement started by that Yemenite Jew who claimed he was the Messiah, increased the confusion within the Jewish community. Yaqub ben Nathanael al-Fayyumi, the head of the Jewish community in Yemen at that time, turned to the greatest scholar of generation, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, who probably in 1172 answered their request with a famous responsa called Geret Teman. Maimonides sent in reply to Rabbi Yaakov, who wrote to him with fear about the hard times of the Jewish community of Yemen was going through. Rabbi Yaakov evidently sought guidance and encouragement, and Maimonides attempt to supply both. The epistle to Yemen, probably a compilation of several shorter responsa, was written by Maimonides in reply to an inquiry or inquiries by Rabbi Yaakov, who wrote to Maimonides, the most powerful Jewish authority of the time, to which the letter replied at length with empathy and attention. Despite the clear danger involved, Maimonides wrote his bold response in Arabic so that his words would be understood by all members of the threatened Yemenite community. Maimonides, in his epistle to Yemen, heaps lavish praises upon the Jews of Yemen in his day, and uses hyperbolic speech to describe the condition in which he found them. Evidently, Maimonides had knowledge of the Jews of Yemen, and avoided that they maintained a strict adherence to Jewish law and custom, long before his writings became widespread throughout Yemen. In his epistle to Yemen, Maimonides stresses the state of high learnedness and aptitude of the Jews of Yemen. Maimonides addressed a letter to Rabbi Yaakov, and through him to the entire Jewish population of Yemen. He states that the root of all anti-Semitism throughout the age in way of the Jews being the chosen people and the recipients of the God-given Torah, unable to do battle with the Almighty himself, the Hatters turned their jealous rage toward his people. In his epistle to Yemen, Maimonides said to Rabbi Yaakov, remember that ours is the true and authentic divine religion, revealed to us through Moses, the master of the former as well as the later prophets, by means of which God has distinguished us from the rest of mankind, as scripture says. We quoted from Deuteronomy verse 15, chapter 10 from Deuteronomy. And he said also, this didn't happen because of our merits, but rather as an act of divine grace, and on account of our forefathers who were cognizant of God and submitted to him, as we'll read in Deuteronomy 7, chapter 7 and verse 7. In his detailed response, Maimonides tried to console Rabbi Yaakov for the bad times, asked him to pray diligently and to keep in mind that troubles come and go and will eventually pass. He urged him not to surrender to persecutions and forced conversion decrees, as these already happened in the past, yet the Jews prevailed. Rabbi Yaakov had conjectured that perhaps the influences of the stars were responsible for these occurrences, to which conjectures Maimonides replied that Rabbi Yaakov ought to expunge from his heart the vain concept of being able to determine the influence of the constellations, yet counseled him and the Jewish people of Yemen on how they were to act with respect to the pseudo-Messiah in order to save from him harmful effects. Maimonides referred to both Islam and Christianity as false religions, not to be trusted upon, and argued the Maimonides used not to conduct calculations of the end of times, nor try to predict the exact time of the redemption. Also, he wrote about Jesus the Christ. Maimonides said, the first one to have adopted this plan was Jesus the from Nazarene. May his bones be ground to dust. He was a Jew because his mother was a Jewess, although his father was a Gentile. For in accordance with the principle of our law, a child born of a Jewess and a Gentile, or of a Jewess and a slave, is legitimate. This according Yebamot 45a, Jesus is only figuratively termed an illegitimate child. He implied people to believe that he was a prophet sent by God to clarify perplexities in the Torah, and that he was the Messiah that was predicted by each and every seer. He interpreted the Torah and its precepts in such a fashion as to lead to their total annulment, to the abolition of all its commandments, and to the violation of its prohibition. the size of blessed memory, having become aware of his plans before his reputations spread among our people, meted out fitting punishment to him. About Nabi Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad and Islam, Maimonides said, after his arose, means after Jesus Christ, after his arose, the madman who emulated his precursor, since he paved the way for him, but he added the further objective of procuring rule and submission, and he invented his well-known religion. In your letter, you mentioned that the apostle has spurred on a number of people to believe that several verses in scripture allude to the madman, such as he mentioned in Genesis 17:20 and Deuteronomy 33:1 and Genesis 17:20. Some words where they refer to Nabi Muhammad in the Old Testament as this. These arguments have been rehearsed so often that they have become, yes, it is not enough to declare that they are altogether feeble, nay, to cite as proofs these verses is ridiculous and absurd in the extreme. We skip here. As for the new Messiah, Maimonides clearly stated that he was a false Messiah, a man not to be trusted as a true savior. He warned the Jews of Yemen and urged them to halt that man and denounce him, lest the Muslims would rage and take revenge against the Jewish community. Maimonides advised that the self-proclaimed Messiah is nothing but an impostor and no doubt a madman. He urged them to remain firm in the belief that God will send the true Messiah to redeem the Jewish people from suffering in exile at the proper time. Maimonides ordered Rabbi Jacob to copy spread his response to all communities, as he honestly feared for them and reckoned the Jews of Yemen were in concrete and immediate danger. The epistle was successful and accomplished its purpose. The Yemenite Jews, one second.
No, we didn't. It would be great if you could repeat those closing lines, please. Thank you.
I said that the epistle was successful and accomplished its purpose. the Maimonides Jews remained faithful to their religion in the face of their bitter suffering. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon used his influence as the court of Saladin in Egypt to intervene in their behalf, and persecution came to an end. The Jewish community of Yemen gratefully appreciated both the spiritual advice as well as the actual help of Maimonides in the hour of their distress. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hawari, for a really fascinating in-depth look into the epistle and Maimonides' influence in Yemen. I'm so sorry for the interruptions, and I'm so sorry that it's had to cut short our session a little bit. I think we have time for 2 questions, and Yoram is going to lead the questioning session.
Okay.
I have a question.
First to Professor Jefferson. To you, Rebecca, can you address a question from the previous session? Why the consent by the chief rabbi of the Cairo's Jewish community permitted the removal of or the transfer out of Egypt of genizot? And if we have time just for yet another question, this is to Professor Abu-Ghrar. First, Alf Mabruk, congratulations for your new book on the Jewish community, which, as you know, I'm looking forward to read. The question is about the reception of the book, about how the book was received in Egypt. And thank you so much.
The book was a bestseller for the first couple of months. And this month from today, it is number 3 on the best-selling list in Egypt. So it is doing very, very well. And there are many articles written about the book and many comments written in different parts. I want to have a question also to Dr. Jefferson, if you may allow me to do that. What do you think are the possibilities?
We will be delighted to take your question, and then Professor Jefferson, you answer brief as much as you can, and we have to close down this session. Thank you.
Okay, my question is, what did you think are the possibilities to find Geniza in Basatine or in any place in Egypt? If there is any real possibility?
2 very difficult.
Egyptian Geniza kept in Egypt.
And if you can send us the location
yeah.
Those are 2 quite difficult questions. The first one, it's hard to answer because we can't mind read, so we don't really know what Rabbi Raphael ben Shimon was thinking at the time, but we have some clues. And so I would say that there may be sort of 4 things that we can look at. 2 of them are his viewpoints, and 2 of them are practicalities. The viewpoints are his view and the view of others of a geniza. I mean, which we remember that these were materials that were put aside, either hidden or decided to be buried for good. And so their attitude towards them wouldn't be our attitude as historians and academics, and they wouldn't have necessarily seen the potential in fragmentary material. Also, he was a scholar in his own right. He was born in Morocco, family moved to Jerusalem. He went back to Morocco as emissary, and he established a society called the, let me remind myself, Dovevei, what was it? Dovevei Siftei Yeshurun, I think that was the society. Essentially, it was to publish to encourage the Moroccan Jews to publish old Moroccan Jewish writings. So the emphasis was really on print culture and bringing older Jewish writings to the attention of Moroccan Jewry through print. So, with an emphasis on print, there was less of a feeling towards the importance of retaining manuscripts once they were in print. So, those are two of his known viewpoints. And then there were the practicalities. He wasn't the only one involved in this removal of materials. Certainly, he was involved in Solomon Schechter's removal. But there were members of the community. There were the beadles, the people on the ground. It was such it's a complicated story and doesn't involve just one individual in making that choice. Also, we have evidence that Solomon Schechter paid for the collection. We know that he paid at least £300 sterling for the materials, and we don't know whether this was one complete payment or whether it was payment given through bakshish or other means, but we do know that he paid for the collection. And so this was, practicality-wise, this was an important consideration for the community at the time. So those are my answers. They're not definitive answers. There's kind of guesswork towards what he was thinking and why he released those materials. Oh, and then, sorry, the other question was
the possibilities to find the Geniza in Egypt.
That's a hard one to answer as well. We know that in the 1980s, there were some excavations and some materials discovered near the Basatine Cemetery. The count that I mentioned, Count Dulst, in the early 20th century, made a note that he knew of another Geniza and he was never going to share that secret with anyone because everyone had let him down. So I think that, and also given the fact that many of the synagogues had Genizot, the practice of Geniza differed between communities. Some buried them, some hid them away. I think that, yeah, there could be, but you know, I don't want to send anyone on a manuscript hunt. So I don't know. I don't know if any of my esteemed colleagues have opinions on that as well.
Okay, thanks a lot for the speakers in yet another great session. The conference will be resumed according to the program tomorrow. All are welcome to join us. Thank you and good night, everybody.
Yoram, just a second. Yoram, just a second. There was a question about some remark of Livana concerning Dr. Abulhar book. So what I would like to announce that in the near, let's say after 2 or 3 weeks from now, Dr. Abulhar accepted that we will organize a conference, a Zoom conference about his book, where he can explain with more details about what it's all about. Because lately, although the book have been very well received in Egypt, there was a lot of comments from a lot of Jews, diaspora Jews. So he accepted to moderate this, and I think even Yoram can help us like this. All the comments can be revealed in a different session.
Good. Okay. So with this positive note, and we are looking forward not only for the session on Abulhar's new book, but to see you all, inshallah, Be'ezrat Hashem, tomorrow. Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Later.
Good
night.